It is a terrifying realization when the very stone fortress you designed to conquer the untamed wild turns against you, slowly draining the life from your oligai's body, while a house built of nothing but trees and bark holds the key to survival. Henry Gerard stood in the center of his half-completed trading outpost, staring at the massive 3-foot-thick limestone walls with a deep sense of pride. He was a classically trained architect and stonemason from France, a man who believed that European order, heavy masonry, and iron tools could tame any environment on Earth. When he received his commission to build a Dayton, secure trade depot in the snowy wilderness bordering the Adirondack Mountains, he had smiled at the challenge, confident that his structural designs would easily withstand whatever this raw continent could throw at him. He had spent the summer supervising his crew, directing the grueling labor of quarrying limestone blocks from the nearby river cliffs, mixing thick mortar and stacking the heavy stones into an imposing rectangular fortress. To Henry, this garrison was a monument to progress, a safe haven of civilized comfort in a sea of wild, chaotic forest. He had designed the building with small, narrow windows to minimize heat loss, and he had built 2 massive fireplaces with iron-baffled flues, believing that the sheer volume of stone would absorb the heat of the fires and keep his men warm through the dark months. His crew worked tirelessly, motivated by the promise of warmth and safety, once the winter winds began to howl. By late October, the stone walls stood solid and imposing, a gray monument rising out of the pine and spruce. But as Henri watched the first light snow settle across the forest, he felt a strange, creeping unease that he could not quite explain. From the roof of his stone fortress, he could look across the clearing to a nearby Haudenosaunee village, where the local families were busy preparing their own homes for the winter. To Henri, their homes looked like flimsy, primitive structures, long arched tunnels made of thin saplings and covered in sheets of bark. He had watched them work with a mix of amusement and pity, wondering how any sensible people could expect to survive a northern winter in what was essentially an oversized basket. He laughed with his men at the trading post, telling them that the first real blizzard would collapse those rounded bark roofs, leaving the inhabitants at the mercy of the freezing air. His men had joined in his laughter, comforting themselves with the sight of their solid stone walls and the high stacks of green birch and pine logs had piled near the entrance. They believed, as Henry did, that stone was permanent, that stone was safe, and that the local people lived in misery because they lacked the tools and the knowledge to build a real home. But the wilderness was quietly preparing a lesson in humility, a lesson that would begin with the very mortar holding Henri's fortress together. As November progressed, the damp autumn winds from the north grew sharper, bringing a wet, penetrating cold that seemed to linger in the air. Henri noticed that the stone walls, which had felt so solid during the summer, now felt cold and clammy to the touch, absorbing the ambient moisture from the air and holding it like a damp blanket. No matter how high he piled the wood in the iron-baffled fireplaces, the chill remained in the corners of the garrison, a persistent draft that seemed to mock his designs. His men began to complain of cold feet, huddled close to the war hearths even during the day, their breath rising in small, faint plumes inside. The main room, Henry told them to build the fires hotter, to stack the logs higher. But the cold stone walls seemed to draw the warmth out of the air, bleed it directly into the frozen ground outside. The thick limestone blocks, instead of acting as a barrier, were acting as a highway for the cold, pulling the heat from the room and radiating a relentless, bone-chilling dampness. Henri watched the smoke rise from the Haudenosaunee longhouses in the distance, noting how steady and thin the trails were compared to the roaring fires in his own fireplaces. He shook his head, convinced that they were simply freezing in silence, too stubborn to admit their failure. He did not know that the forest people were watching his fortress too, not with envy, but with a quiet, patient concern for the men trapped inside those heavy stone walls. If you want to discover more about how traditional societies solve these extreme challenges, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten historical techniques to light. For Henry Gerard, the first signs of danger were already appearing, and as the winter sky turned the wine color of lead, he began to realize that his proud stone garrison was not the Brayton shield he had imagined, but a cold trap waiting to spring. In early December, before the heavy snows completely blocked the forest trails, Henry Gerard decided to visit the Haudenosaunee village to finalize the winter, trading terms, and secure a steady supply of furs. He walked through the silent forest, his heavy leather boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow, the transition from his stone garrison to the wooden world of the village feeling more pronounced with every step. The forest was different here. The trees seemed to shelter the trail, blocking the worst of the wind and creating a quiet, muffled environment that felt strangely secure. As he approached the village, he was struck by the scale of the longhouses, several massive structures stretching more than 100 feet across the clearing, their bark-covered arches looking like sleeping giants beneath the pine boughs. He was met at the edge of the village by Tayanoga, an experienced elder builder whose face was lined with the Bashan winters of many decades, and Otsitsa, the clan mother, a woman of quiet, commanding presence who carried the welfare of her entire family in her eyes. Otsitsa was the heart of the clan. She managed the distribution of winter food, maintained the social balance within the household, and held the ultimate authority to appoint or remove the leaders who represented her people. Henry, despite his French training, felt a sudden, unexpected sense of respect in her presence, though he quickly dismissed it, returning to his comfortable beliefs of European superiority. He walked with them through the village, his eyes analyzing the longhouses with the critical gaze of an architect, pointing out what he saw as fatal flaws in their construction. He noted the complete absence of stone foundations, the lack of iron nails or brackets, and the missing chimneys, wondering aloud how they could live in a home that had no proper way to vent smoke. Tayanoga listened to Henri's critiques with a patient, polite smile, his eyes reflecting a deep, empirical understanding of the materials surrounding them. He showed Henry the longhouse frame, explaining that they did not build with heavy, rigid timber because the wind would eventually shatter it, and they did not use stone because stone held the cold of the earth. Henry scoffed, pointing to his garrison in the distance, boasting that his limestone walls would stand for 100 years without needing repair. Tayanoga looked at the gray fortress, then back at the flexible saplings of the longhouse, and said that a home should not fight the wind, but move with it, and that stone which fights the winter eventually cracks. Otsitsa joined them, her voice soft but carrying the weight of generations, warning Henri that the great cold was coming, the time when the earth freezes to its bones, and that his heavy stone walls would not keep his men warm if they did not understand how heat actually moves. Henry thanked her for her concern but reassured her that his iron-baffled fireplaces and thick masonry would keep his men in perfect comfort, far warmer than they could ever be in a house made of bark. He looked at the longhouse entrance, a simple opening covered by a heavy deer hide, and shook his head, convinced that a proper wooden door with iron hinges was the only way to keep out the winter drafts. He did not see the subtle exchange of looks between Tayanoga and Otsitsa, a quiet, knowing sigh of people who had seen many proud visitors underestimate the power of the northern winter. Henry returned to his garrison that afternoon, his mind filled with calculations of trade volumes and fur shipments, completely ignoring the lessons written in the flexible wood and overlapping bark of his neighbors' homes. He believed he had built a monument to progress, a safe haven of civilized comfort in a sea of wild, chaotic forest. He did not know that the wilderness was quietly preparing a lesson in humility, and that his proud stone walls were about to become a freezing trap for the men he was responsible for protecting. The technical design of the Haudenosaunee Longhouse was not an accident of primitive construction. It was a highly sophisticated, empirical framework, shaped by generations of observation and survival. Henry Girard, despite his skepticism, found himself drawn back to the village during his afternoon walks, watching the builders assemble a new structure with a level of precision that challenged his classic architectural training. He stood in the clearing, the cold wind biting at his face, as Tayanoga's crew selected young hickory and ash, saplings from the surrounding forest, checking each one for straightness, strength, and flexibility. These were not the ancient, rigid oaks that Henry would have chosen for a traditional European roof truss. These were young, living trees, full of spring sap and natural elasticity. Tayanoga explained that the wood had to be cut green, when the fibers were still wet and capable of bending without fracturing under stress. The builders dug deep, narrow holes in the earth, positioned in two parallel rows exactly 22 feet apart, and planted the base of the saplings deep into the soil, packing them with clay and riverstone for lateral stability. Then, working in coordinated teams, they slowly bent the opposing saplings toward each other, curving them into a high, graceful Gothic arch that met 18 feet overhead. Henri watched the wood creak and flex under the immense tension, expecting it to split at any moment, but the green fibers held, distributing the bending stress evenly along the entire length of the arch. This Gothic curve was a masterclass in structural physics. Unlike a flat or gabled European roof, which concentrates snow load, weight on specific vertical joints, the arched frame distributed the physical weight downward in a continuous, smooth compression line. This design allowed the longhouse to handle thousands of pounds of heavy winter snowpack without requiring thick internal support columns that would clutter the living space. Once the arches were formed, they were bound together at the apex using thick, wet strips of inner basswood and slippery elm bark. Henry, accustomed to iron, brackets, and hand-forged nails, watched in disbelief as the builders tied the joints with simple bark lashings, but Tayanoga explained the physics of the playman drying wood. As the wet bark strips dried, they underwent a process of moisture, loss, and contraction, shrinking by up to 10% in length and tightening the structural joints with a clamping force equivalent to iron bands. The resulting frame was not a rigid, static monument that fought the elements. It was a flexible, dynamic skeleton that could flex and sway with the high winds, absorbing the impact of the storm rather than resisting it through brute strength. Henry began to realize that the longhouse was not an arbitrary shelter, but a carefully engineered system where every joint, every curve, and every material had been chosen with a specific physical purpose. If you are fascinated by these hidden details of traditional engineering, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We have many more stories of historical survival waiting to be shared. For Henry, the sight of this rising wooden rib cage was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, a silent challenge to his beliefs that civilized technology was the only way to conquer the cold. He went back to his garrison and touched his limestone walls, which felt colder and damper than before, and for the first time, he wondered if the wood of the forest possessed a strength that his quarry stone could never match. If the flexible wooden skeleton was the strength of the longhouse, the overlapping elm bark was its shield, a second layer of defense engineered to repel the wind and moisture of the northern winter. Henry Girard returned to the Enniol village in mid-December, watching the builders apply the outer sheathing to the completed hickory frame, a process that resembled the scaling of a massive woodland creature. The sheets of bark had been harvested in the spring, when the sap was running hot, and the bark could be peeled from the living trees in broad, flat panels without killing the tree itself. Tayanoga showed Henri the seasoned panels, which had been dried flat under heavy logs, to prevent curling and cracking, their surfaces rough, fibrous, and naturally saturated with suberin, a waxy waterproofing substance that made them completely impervious to water. The builders began at the base of the structure, securing the bark panels to the horizontal poles of the frame using split spruce root lashings, overlapping each panel by several inches like the scales of a fish. This scaling technique was mathematically precise. Rain and melting snow flowed downward from panel to panel, draining away from the structure without ever finding a seam to penetrate. The overlapping joints also acted as a windbreak, preventing the freezing drafts of the forest from entering the living space, while allowing the building to flex and shift during high winds without tearing the outer skin. A second, external layer of slender poles was then lashed over the bark panels, clamping the entire sheathing system tightly against the inner frame, creating a lightweight, double-walled envelope that was both airtight and resilient. Inside this outer shell, the women of the clan were busy hanging a third layer of commonic defense, double-thick woven cattail mats and dried corn husk panels that lined the interior walls, creating a static air gap between the bark and the living space. Henri recognized this principle immediately. It was a natural convective barrier, a dead airspace that prevented the cold of the outer wall from transferring to the interior air. But his attention was drawn to the roofline, where several large openings had been left directly above the central aisle. He pointed to the sky, asking Tayanoga how they expected to keep the cold out when they had giant holes in their roof, and how they would prevent snow from extinguishing their fires. Tayanoga laughed, a warm, rich sound, and showed Henry the adjustable bark flaps mounted over the smoke holes on long poles. He explained that they did not need chimneys because they understood the wind. By adjusting the flaps based on the wind's direction, they created a low-pressure zone over the opening that pulled the smoke out while preventing rain and snow from entering. It was a passive ventilation system that required no metal, no moving parts, and no complicated maintenance, operating purely on the laws of draft and air pressure. Henri shook his head, still convinced that the open roof would bleed their heat into the night sky, and that his stone garrison's sealed chimney was a far superior design. He did not understand that the smoke holes were part of a larger convective loop that kept the air clean while retaining the warmth of the hearths. He returned to his cold stone fortress, confident in his iron stoves and limestone walls, completely unaware that his civilized designs were about to face a test that would push them to the absolute limits of survival. On the 8th of January 1684, the wind changed, and the true meaning of a northern winter descended on the Adirondacks. It began with an eerie green-gray sky that seemed to press down on the treetops, followed by a sudden, terrifying drop in barometric pressure. By midnight, the temperature had plunged to a brutal 40 degrees below zero, a level of cold that defies description, where the air itself seems to freeze and crack. The wind rose to a sustained 45 miles per hour, screaming down from Canada in horizontal sheets of blinding snow that erased the forest, the village, and the sky in a white wall of absolute chaos. Inside Henri's stone garrison, the wood fires roared in the massive fireplaces, but the limestone walls began to show their true physical nature. The cold of the exterior air, insulated by nothing but 3 feet of solid stone, began to transfer through the limestone blocks with relentless efficiency, acting as a highway for the frost. Henri watched in horror as the interior mortar joints, which had dried hard during the summer, began to sprout long, delicate crystals of ice that spread across the gray stone like winter ivy. The water buckets, positioned just 10 feet from the roaring hearths, froze solid to the bottom within 3 hours of the storm's arrival. The air near the floor dropped to 4 degrees above freezing, a cold, damp draft that scoured the room and sent his men shivering into their bunk beds, wrapped in every blanket and coat they owned. Henry ordered more wood to be thrown on the fires, but the green birch, logs, damp from outdoor storage, hissed and smoldered, producing more smoke than warmth. The chimneys, built of the same cold limestone, could not establish a bait-lazine, proper draft. The freezing column of air inside the flue pressed down on the proper draft, rising smoke, forcing the acrid, choking fumes back into the room. Henry's men coughed in the freezing darkness, their eyes watering, their chests tight from the suffocating air, their hands too numb to split more wood. Henry touched the place in air, stone walls, hoping to feel some retained warmth from the fires, but the limestone felt like blocks of ice, radiating a relentless, bone-chilling cold that seemed to suck the thermal energy directly out of his body. He realized that the stone was not protecting them, it was actively killing them, drawing the heat of their fires and their bodies and bleeding it directly into the howling void outside. The fortress he had built with so much pride had become a plain, freezing vault, and as his men huddled together in the corners, shivering in silent terror, Henry knew that they would not survive another 48 hours in this cold trap of stone. By the third night of the blizzard, the temperature inside the stone garrison had dropped to a dangerous 2 degrees above freezing, and the structural integrity of the outpost began to fail. The extreme temperature differential between the roaring fire inside the hearth and the 40 below zero Arctic wind outside created a destructive force within the stone chimney. With a sound like a pistol shot, the heavy limestone blocks near the flue cracked under the thermal shock, the expanding stone splitting along its natural grain and opening wide gaps in the masonry. Thick, black smoke poured through the cracked stone, filling the main room with a dense, suffocating cloud of creosote and carbon monoxide that made breathing almost impossible. Henry Girard, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion, was forced to make a desperate decision. He ordered the fires to be damped down, but without the heat of the hearths, the cold stone walls absorbed what little warmth remained in the air within minutes. The interior temperature plummeted to 5 degrees below freezing, and Henry watched his men's breath turn to solid frost on their blankets, their fingers turning blue, their shivering growing weak and irregular. He knew the signs of hypothermia. He knew that if they stayed in this smoke-filled icebox, they would sleep and never wake up. He looked through the narrow window, squinting against the blinding horizontal snow, and saw the faint, steady glow of the Stack Haudenosaunee village in the distance, a warm orange beacon in a sea of white chaos. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of humiliation, remembering the laughter of his men and his own arrogant boasts about his stone fortress. But he looked at his shivering crew and knew his pride was not worth their lives. He ordered them to pack their remaining blankets, rope themselves together, and prepare to abandon the garrison. They stepped out into the howling storm, the wind hitting them like a physical blow, knocking 2 of his men to the ground before they had even cleared the door. They struggled through knee-deep drifts, the cold biting through their leather boots, their eyes blind, their bodies numb, guided only by the rope and the distant, flickering light of the longhouses. Henri Girard stumbled through the snow, his mind filled with a terrifying, absolute certainty that if they did not reach the bark arches of his neighbors, they would become another set of frozen monuments in this unforgiving wilderness. The grueling struggle through the blizzard was a blur of freezing white chaos, but as Henri Girard and his half-frozen men reached the longhouse, the physical structure of the entrance offered their first lesson in survival. They stumbled into the outer vestibule, a low, narrow tunnel built of overlapping elm bark that extended 15 feet from the main wall of the building. This baffled entranceway was a masterclass in pressure dynamics, as the 50-mile-per-hour Wind slammed against the opening. The restricted volume of the tunnel compressed the air, creating a natural back-pressure zone that deflected the wind over and around the building. Henri noticed that the howling draft, which had been cutting through his heavy woolen coat like a knife just seconds ago, suddenly dropped to a gentle breeze as they moved deeper into the tunnel. They passed through a second heavy deer-hide curtain and stepped into the main hall of the main hall, longhouse. And the physical transformation of the air was so sudden it felt almost impossible. The interior air was warm, steady, and breathable, holding a 1 Mars breathable, comfortable temperature of 21 degrees Celsius, with no draft, no frost, and no cold pockets near the floor. Henri stood blinking in the warm orange light, his face thawing, his fingers beginning to tingle with a painful, beautiful warmth as his circulation returned. The longhouse was filled with the rich, comforting scent of dried cedar, roasted cornmeal, and sweet grass, a world away from the choking, acrid smoke of his cracked stone fortress. He looked down the long, arched corridor and saw families sitting comfortably on raised wooden platforms, their children playing on the clean dirt floor in 10, nothing but light leather dresses and tunics, completely unbothered by the screaming blizzard outside. Otsitsa, the clan mother, approached them with warm, wooden bowls of boiled hominy and squash, her eyes reflecting no surprise, only a calm, generous welcome for the freezing men. Henri wrapped his numb fingers around the warm clay bowl, feeling the heat transfer into his hands, and looked around the room in wonder, wondering how this house of bark could hold so much heat when his limestone fortress had frozen solid. Tayanoga guided his men to the central hearths, where comfortable sleeping platforms covered in deep beaver and bear furs had been prepared for them. Henri sank onto the soft pelts, his body finally releasing the tension of the cold, and watched the fires burn steadily in the central aisle, their flames clear, their heat radiating evenly throughout the entire building without a single draft to disturb the air. If you want to support our channel and help us share more of these incredible traditional survival designs, please subscribe and like this video. We read every comment and appreciate your journey with us. For Henri Girard, the sight of his men warm, safe, and breathing clean air was the beginning of a profound transformation, a moment when his European pride surrendered to the simple, beautiful physics of the longhouse. The secret to the longhouse's extraordinary warmth did not lie in burning tin, massive amounts of wood, but in how the structure managed the heat it produced through natural convection and thermal mass. Henri Girard spent his first full day inside the building, observing the air currents with the analytical mind of an architect, tracing the path of the warmth from the central hearths to the curved roofline. He noted that the 5 fires were not concentrated in one massive fireplace, but were spaced at regular intervals along the central aisle, each shared by 2 neighboring families. This layout was a deliberate distribution strategy. Instead of creating one hot zone and several cold corners, the spaced hearths distributed heat evenly throughout the entire 5-foot length of the building. Above each fire, a roof opening acted as a breathing passage, but Henri noticed that very little warm air actually escaped through the smoke holes. The adjustable bark flaps on the roof were positioned to deflect the cold wind over the opening, creating a slight, low-pressure zone that slowly pulled the carbon monoxide and smoke out of the building while leaving the heavier, warm air trapped inside. This created a stable, suspended boundary layer of warm smoke and air high beneath the curved ceiling, which functioned as an invisible, floating thermal blanket. This stratified boundary layer of warm air reflected the radiant heat of the fires, back down to the raised platforms, keeping the living areas comfortable while protecting the winter food supplies hanging from the rafters. Henri looked up at the hundreds of dried ears of corn, beans, medicinal herbs, and smoked venison, realizing that the smoke was not a waste product, but a preservative and an insulator, keeping insects away and preventing moisture from rotting their food. But the most remarkable aspect of the heating system was the people themselves. Henry calculated that the 50 occupants of the longhouse released a constant, passive metabolic heat of over 20,000 BTUs per hour. In this tightly sealed, highly insulated bark envelope, that biological warmth was captured, retained, maintaining a comfortable baseline temperature even when the fires burned down to glowing embers overnight. The raised wooden platforms, covered in woven mats and thick furs, lifted the families 3 feet above the colder dirt floor, positioning them in the optimal zone where the warm air naturally lingered. Even the firewood was part of the system, stacked neatly beneath the platforms where the warm, dry air of the room seasoned the split pine before it ever reached the hearth, ensuring it burned at peak thermodynamic efficiency. Henri sat on his platform, watching the air rise and circulate through the bland, graceful curves of the hickory arches, and realized that Tayanoga's people had designed a living machine, a system that used gravity, pressure, and biological warmth to survive the absolute worst of the northern winter. As the storm finally broke on the morning of January 14th, the sun rose into a sky so clear it looked like glass, reflecting off a landscape buried under 6 feet of snow. Inside the Haudenosaunee longhouse, Henri Girard lay on his raised wooden platform, wrapped in a heavy beaver pelt, watching the morning light filter through the snow-capped smoke holes. The warmth of the room held steady at 21 degrees Celsius, a gentle, comforting heat that felt almost miraculous after the private, freezing terror of his stone garrison. He felt a profound, overwhelming wave of humility wash over him, a deep shame for the arrogance he had carried since the summer. He looked at his men, who were sleeping soundly, their faces relaxed, their hands warm, and he realized that they were alive only because of the flexible wood and overlapping bark he had mocked as primitive. His stone fortress, built with French tools and European pride, sat empty and frozen in the distance, a cold monument to his limitations, while this bark home, built without a single metal nail, had kept 50 people in safety and comfort through Prapel.com, the worst blizzard of the decade. He watched Otsitsa move quietly between the hearths, checking on the children, organizing the distribution of cornmeal, dried fish, and he realized that the longhouse was far more than a shelter. It was a physical manifestation of their social philosophy. The cooperation required to survive this winter was built into the very architecture of the dais. Home, the shared hearths, the open living spaces, and the collective storage all reinforced the truth that they were one family, bound together by mutual trust and shared responsibility. Henri climbed down from the platform, his boots silent on the clean dirt floor, and approached Tayanoga, who was sitting near the central fire, mending a snowshoe with split spruce roots. Henri stood before him for a long moment, struggling to find the words to express the depth of his realization, then extended his hand. He thanked Tayanoga for his shelter, his wood, and his patience, admitting openly that his masonry theories had been wrong, and that the longhouse was a masterpiece of engineering he had been too proud to see. Tayanoga shook his hand, his eyes warm and filled with a quiet, respectful understanding, and told Henry that there was no shame in learning from the forest, for the forest had been teaching his people for many generations. Henry sat beside him, his mind open to the lessons of the wood, and, for the first time, he listened not as a teacher, but as a student, eager to understand the subtle, beautiful physics that kept this ancient world warm. Spring arrived slowly in the St. Lawrence Valley, the snow melting into roaring rivers that washed away the debris of winter and brought new life to the forest. Henri Girard spent his remaining months in the territory working alongside Tayanoga, studying the longhouses with a new sense of purpose, and a notebook filled with detailed sketches of hickory arches and overlapping bark panels. He watched the spring maintenance process with fascination. The families inspected every inch of their wooden homes, replacing weathered elm bark with fresh sheets, renewing worn basswood lashings, and turning old damaged saplings into firewood. Nothing was wasted. Everything found new life in the cycle of everyday survival. One afternoon, Tayanoga told Henri that after 20 years, when the soil lost its strength and the nearby firewood became scarce, the clan would dismantle the village and move to a new location. Henri was stunned, asking why they would abandon such a beautiful, engineered home after so much labor, but Tayanoga explained the philosophy of renewal. He said that a home should not outlast its forest, and that by moving the village, they allowed the old site to return naturally to the wild, giving the earth time to heal and reclaim the clearing. Within a generation, the forest would cover the old longhouses, the soil would recover its strength, and wildlife would return to a land that had been respected rather than exhausted. This ecological balance was not a separate policy. It was woven into the very fabric of their architectural design, a continuous cycle of birth, use, and return. Henry Girard left the Wilderness Inn the summer of 1684, carrying with him a different understanding of architecture, progress, and human survival. He returned to Europe, but he never built with stone the same way again. His new designs incorporated passive ventilation, thermal mass, and natural materials that respected the environment rather than trying to conquer it. The longhouse had done far more than keep his body warm. During that brutal winter, it had thawed his mind, showing him that the smartest technology does not always come from machines, but grows quietly in the forest, waiting for people wise enough to learn from it. The engineering principles applied within the Haudenosaunee longhouse convective, envelope design, stratified thermal mass, and passive moisture management were not primitive improvisations. They were sophisticated, highly calculated responses to extreme climates that predated modern architectural science by centuries. Today, as sustainable builders increasingly turn toward natural ventilation, organic materials, and carbon-neutral designs, the legacy of the Sids the Fidio longhouse continues to inspire. It remains a powerful testament to the idea that the most effective shelter works with the laws of nature, rather than trying to conquer them. Ultimately, the survival of the Haudenosaunee through centuries of brutal winters proves that true structural resilience does not depend on the density of 26 stone or the burning of fossil fuels. It depends on a deep, respectful understanding of the natural world and the strength of a community built to weather the storm together.